Hello, and welcome to my video where I'm going to talk to you about audits of US listed Chinese companies. Now, you may be wondering why we're going to be talking about China today. After all, most of you will be working in the US as auditors. Well, there are a couple of reasons. One reason is that there have been a lot of audit failures and accounting frauds involving companies that are listed in the US but actually originate in China. Okay, so I think it's good for you to have some knowledge about what's been happening out there in the China sector. And I'll talk to you about what factors led to so many Chinese companies being accused of committing accounting fraud. Now, before we go any further, I should just explain that this is by no means, a China bashing class or anything like that. I love China. I used to work in China for 8 years. My family is largely Chinese. My children are mixed race, half Chinese, half English. I have property interests in China. I have family in China. So this is definitely not any antipathy towards China. And indeed, as we go through today's class, what you'll see is that some of the reasons why there were so many fraudulent companies is actually nothing to do with China so much. It's actually more about the US capital markets. Okay, so I want you to understand that we're going to take a very balanced approach to this. This is not a China bashing session in any way. Okay, so the first reason is just because there are so many frauds. I want you to have some understanding of what's been going on and why there were so many frauds. And then the second reason that we're going to talk about this is that the way in which the frauds were committed are quite interesting. They raise some interesting auditing issues. So, that's another good reason to talk about this so that you can learn how to become a better auditor, okay? Because the types of frauds that are occurring in China are not just unique to Chinese companies. They can take place with other types of companies as well. But the case studies I found happen to be Chinese case studies, and they are particularly interesting. Okay, so learning objectives for today. First of all, I'm going to describe the factors that enabled so many US listed Chinese companies to commit fraud. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the role of short sellers in helping to detect the frauds. And then I'm going to go through a couple of case study examples. The first one is a company called Longtop Financial Technologies, and the second one is a more recent fraud allegation involving a company called Luckin Coffee, which is kind of China's equivalent to Starbucks. All right, so those are the objectives for today's seminar. You should read through the seminar outline before coming to class. The reading, you should read the Longtop case study. Please note that there will be a pop quiz about this case study to make sure that students have read the case before we have the class. This case, the Longtop case, is question 1 on your seminar outline, and part 5 of question 1 is asking about the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act, the PSLRA. So I've provided here a wiki link. This link will help you to answer part 5. You should read through the Luckin Coffee case as an anonymous report. You only need to skim through the report. You don't need to read through the entire report in detail. And this will help you to answer part A of question 2. Okay. So just skim through this. Don't read it through in detail. There's an awful lot in the report, but part A is just asking you for kind of summary information about this case. There's the video that I'm doing right now. There's a video interview with Carson Block. Now, he is the CEO of Muddy Waters, which is a short selling firm. And that firm was one of the short sellers that was responsible for identifying many of the accounting frauds, okay, in these companies. So this is a very interesting interview that you should watch. Then there's some optional readings down here. There's a practice alert that was issued by the PCAOB in 2010, which is talking about what auditors should consider when using the work of other auditors. And this is relevant because when auditing the US listed Chinese companies, very often the US auditors were using the work of other auditors in mainland China. Okay, so that's why this is relevant. Then there was another practice alert, number 8, which was issued in 2011, which talks about audit risks in certain emerging markets. Really, this was focused on China because China was by far the largest emerging market in terms of US listed companies. Reading number 8 is about reverse mergers. Okay, so there's a PCAOB research note about that, and I'll be talking more about reverse mergers in the class. And then there's another article here about reverse mergers. This was an investor bulletin the SEC issued in 2011, warning investors about the risks of buying shares in reverse merger companies. Okay, so in the class, I explained to you what a reverse merger is and why this type of transaction indicates a high risk type of company. Okay, question 1 is about the Long Top case. There's quite a lot to read here in the case. So this is all the information here. Then there are 5 sets of questions. The first set of questions is about internal controls. The second one is about fraud risk. Okay, so what indicators were there that Longtop was a high risk company? The third question is about using audit confirmations. Okay, so there's some very interesting implications for the use of confirmations arising from the Longtop audit. The fourth one is about related party transactions. Okay, as you'll see in the class, a lot of the frauds involving Chinese companies do involve related party transactions. Okay, so Longtop was not an exception. Right? So we'll talk about what is a related party transaction and what evidence is there that this Siam and Longtop Human Resources Services company was a related party. How did Longtop use related party transactions to misstate its financial statements? And then part 5, this is what I was talking about earlier. This is a question about the PSLRA, the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act. And there are 2 parts of this. First of all, how did the act affect auditor liability? And you'll need to do a little bit of independent research to answer this question. You can Google it. Or you can look at the Wikipedia link that I gave you in the reading list. And then part B, how are the effects of the PSLRA evident in the class action suit against Longtop? Okay, so the PSLRA is mentioned in the case. So that's question 1. Question 2 is about Luckin Coffee. Okay, so this was another fraud that was detected by a short seller. And here's some information here about the background to the company and what happened. And then I've got 4 questions here. The first question is asking about the anonymous report that was published by Muddy Waters. Okay, it wasn't Muddy Waters. The reason this is anonymous is that it wasn't Muddy Waters that wrote the report. It was somebody else who wrote the report, but they gave it to Muddy Waters for them to publish. Okay, so there are 5 smoking gun claims. If you look at the summary of this report at the beginning, you'll see the 5 claims, and I just want you to basically tell me what those claims were for part A. Part B asks, why do you think the author of the report sent the report to Carson Block, Muddy Waters, instead of publishing it on his own? Part C, compare and contrast the economic incentives that auditors and short sellers have to detect and reveal frauds. And then part D, do you think auditors should be allowed to take a short position in a former audit client after they resign from the client? And give reasons for your answer. Okay, so that's question 2. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about the background to today's topic, right? Chinese companies, and I emphasize I'm talking only here about Chinese companies listed in the United States. I'm not going to be making any claims about the risks involved in auditing Chinese companies that are listed in China, right? You'll see the reasons for that later in the class when I talk about why so many US listed companies got involved in fraud. Okay, so why is China important? Well, it's important to the US markets because China accounts for such a large fraction of foreign companies listed in the US. So to provide some comparison here, I chose the UK as another foreign country. I chose the UK because that's where I'm from. And just to provide a bit of comparison here. So from 2004 to 2011, it turns out that there were 360 Chinese companies that were listed in the United States. In comparison, there were only 39 UK companies over the same period, right? So nearly 10 times as many Chinese companies as UK companies, right? So China, UK is not a small economy, but you can see it's massively dwarfed by China here, right? So China is very important to US capital markets. And then the second point is that there have been many allegations of fraudulent accounting and also substandard auditing at the Chinese companies that are listed in the United States. Okay, so just to persuade you of that, I've listed here some examples of the companies that have been accused of engaging in fraud. On the left here, I have the name of the company, and on the right, I have the nature of the fraud allegation. And as you look through these cases, I'm not going to read all of them out, but as you look through these cases, you'll see that there are some common themes that emerge. Right? One of the themes is stealing, essentially, by company insiders, and the use of related party transactions to commit the fraud. Okay, so the first example of advanced battery technologies is an illustration of this. The company transferred a key subsidiary to a chairman. Right? So, this is just basically looting of the company's asset by a chairman. At least that was the allegation. Overstatement of revenues and repayment of a falsified loan to the chairman. Right? So the company paid some money to the chairman, but the payment was recorded as if it was a repayment of a loan, but in fact, no loan was actually made. It was just money being paid to the chairman. So that's an example of related party transactions, right, involving the chairman. Bodison Biotech, this is another example of related party transactions, right? It says misleading and or inaccurate disclosures about RPTs. China Agritech, overstatement of revenues, plants lying idle and incapable of producing significant products. China Century Dragon Media, discrepancies with customer confirmations. So this is something that came up during the auditing process, right? The auditor found that there are discrepancies in the confirmation of accounts receivables. Also, the auditor was unable to verify bank records of the company. China Education Alliance. This is an example which is quite common, where the fraud was discovered by individuals who are comparing filings to the SAIC and filings made to the SEC. Okay, so this requires a little bit of background explanation here. The SAIC is a state administration for industry and commerce. Okay, so if you're a company in China, you have to file information with the SAIC, and that information is scrutinized by the government. Okay, well, of course, filings to the SEC, this is information that's being provided to US investors. So why would there be discrepancies? Well, when a company is involved in fraud, if it's overstating its profits, it's not going to want to overstate its profits when it reports to the SAIC, because then the government will say, Chinese government will say, hey, you're making lots of profits, you should be paying us more tax. Okay, so these companies who are overstating profits will tend to report the truth or even understate their profits when reporting to the SAIC, but when they report to the SEC, they overstate their profits because they're trying to convince investors that the company is doing really well. So one way to identify some of these frauds is to look for discrepancies between these filings. Now that may sound quite easy. In practice, it's quite difficult if you're a foreign investor because foreign investors are not allowed to get direct access to these filings. In fact, you have to use a Chinese legal firm to be able to obtain access to these SAIC filings. So some short sellers have been able to do that, but it's not as straightforward as it might sound initially. Okay, so there's some examples, but there are many examples, and all of these have a, not all of them, but most of them have a familiar feel to them when you read through them. So for example, China integrated energy, transfer of company funds to management through fraudulent acquisitions, overstated assets. So again, this is another related party transaction where management are looting from the company. China Intelligent Lighting and Electronics, there were forged accounting records and forged bank statements and discrepancies in accounts receivable. China Media Express Holdings, overstatement of revenues, fraudulent bank statements. The auditor had resigned because the auditor disclosed that management was not acting in good faith. China Medical, transfer of company funds to management through fraudulent acquisitions, very similar to this one here. China Integrated Energy. China Natural Gas, chairman misusing company funds to benefit a family. China Northeast Petroleum, again, improper cash transfers from a company to the company's management. So these are very similar, right? Very often involving related party transactions. So here's some more. I'm not going to read all of these out, but you can pick out some highlights like this one here, China Biotics. Again, this is a fraud that was discovered by comparing the filings to the SAIC and the SEC. Okay. So lots and lots of alleged frauds from these companies. Here's Longtop. Okay, this is the case that we'll talk about in class. Where there were undisclosed related party transactions and profit margins were overstated. We'll cover that in more detail in question 1. Orient Paper, this is a very famous fraud. Haven't got time to discuss it in today's seminar, but if you want to read about that, that's quite an interesting case. You can find information about that from the Muddy Waters website. Yeah, so lots and lots of frauds, or allegations of frauds, I should say. Wonder Auto Technologies, again, failure to disclose related party transactions. So RPTs are very common methods for committing fraud. All right, so that's just a kind of very brief summary of some of the cases. And we'll look in much more detail later in the class about 2 of the cases, right? We'll look at Longtop and then a more recent case involving Luckin Coffee. What I'm going to do to begin the class online is I'll talk to you about the factors that enabled the fraud. So in other words, why were there so many frauds? Okay. And I think there were 4 main reasons why there were a lot of frauds. One reason was there was a widespread use of reverse mergers by these Chinese companies compared to companies from other countries like the UK, for example, where reverse mergers were not used so much to access US markets. China companies were very often using reverse mergers. So I will explain to you what a reverse merger is and why this can help to facilitate fraud. Secondly, the other second reason is that US investors were very excited about China's strong growth, but they were very poorly informed about the risks. Okay, so this was another factor that enabled the fraud, right? US investors saw that China was growing quickly. There's some very successful, very profitable, strong growing companies. And so they wanted to benefit by investing in those companies. But they're poorly informed. And so where there's information asymmetry, there's a natural inclination to have an adverse selection problem with low quality companies coming to the market and trying to dupe investors into purchasing their equity. So I think that's the second reason. I'll talk more about that. Third reason is that actually China at that time in 2010, 2011, had quite strict listing criteria, much stricter actually than the United States. And so this is one of the reasons why I say, this is not a case of China bashing. This is actually a case where we can say that these frauds that affected the US markets were partly the US fault. Right? The US did not have such strict listing criteria as China did. If it had done, maybe those fraudulent companies would have gone to a different country rather than going to the US. Right? But the US's lax listing criteria really attracted these low quality companies. So that's the third factor. And then the fourth one is, which is most relevant to our topic because we're talking about auditing, is that these companies were receiving low quality audits, and also there was a lack of PCAOB enforcement because the PCAOB was not able to inspect the audits that were carried out in China of these US listed companies. Okay, so I'll talk more about these four factors in the class. That's the end of this video.